Welcome to Twigsy. This is an extended interview with Erik Mueggler. I spoke with him recently while working on the video for George Forrest and the Naxi collectors, and lots of good information in what he had to say. So I wanted to put that out as an interview for you to watch if you so chose to dig in a little bit deeper. So please enjoy.
So my name's Erik Mueggler. I am an anthropologist and I work at the University of Michigan. I worked for many years with indigenous people in Southwest China. And most of my work is on people known as E, not on the indigenous folks that this book is about. And this book is about Naxi, are one of my interests.
And I am going to torture him with questions about a book he wrote 15 years ago. So my apologies for going back so far. Reading this book, you describe an intention to show how two botanists and the local people documented the world on paper, and I guess existed in this metaphor of Earth as a book. But one result of the book is that it seemed to have struck a bit of a nerve for some people, because it shined a light on a little bit of, I guess, scientific colonization. So is that something, was that a secondary intent? Was that not an intent of your efforts in writing this book?
Yeah, well, let me actually try to tell you where the book did come from. Previously, I had written about, I'd done, a couple of years of field work in a small village in that part of China. It was an indigenous village. And one of the things that most interested me there was exorcism. Everybody had ghosts. Ghosts had to be exorcised a lot just to heal people. And a compelling and interesting thing about exorcisms is that they included long speeches that would guide ghosts and the people listening to the speeches as well across the landscape, the very real landscape of that part of China. And it was always intriguing to me how it was thought that journeys taken in the imagination, but journeys taken in the imagination that also might link up to real journeys that people had taken, by foot, were thought to be healing. Like there was something about just the landscape and the movement over the landscape that was thought to be healing. And so thinking about that, well, partly for part of this, to write this book, I wanted to read everything about the history of the area. And so, I picked up some work that I wasn't very interested in, which was botanists who, because there are very few Chinese sources actually that engage with the very local area that I was interested in. I picked up, work in other languages, and some of that work was written by botanists. And, I was at first I was like, okay, whatever, I have to read this. It's not that interesting to me. But then as I started to read these botanical accounts, these strange echoes appeared with the exorcism chants that I'd been working so assiduously on. They were also accounts that described the landscape in detail, described movement over the landscape in detail, and that were also intended to create a kind of shift in the way people felt, or the way the way they felt during their day, whether or not they were disturbed or not. Much of the work did seem to be intended to heal people in some way, psychically anyway. So that was the thought that got me started on this book. So even though the book is about two Western botanists, at heart it's meant to be about the indigenous people that worked for the botanists, as much as possible about those people. Again, those people didn't write. There was nothing written about them. The botanists wrote an enormous amount, but they didn't really write very much about the people who worked with them. So it required some innovation there. But the point that I'm just trying to make is that from the very start, it was meant to be about the the actual workers who were working, the indigenous workers who were working in science, who were roped into the science by these Western botanists.
As a side note, I can make assumptions, but how do you pronounce the name of the village? Involvico or
Mulika,
say that again?
Mulika.
Ooh, that's a rough one. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a kind of language, right? It's not that rough. It's Mulika.
Going back to when you were looking at Forrest's experience, what led Forrest's decision to use people to cover more land, and specifically local people in this small village?
George Forrest was set to work on primulas through contacts with a couple of Catholic priests who had done a good deal of work on primulas further to the west in the Salween River Valley. So he was interested in primulas through these priests, and the priests also mentioned a priest who had worked on primulas in the Yongshishan, the Jade Dragon
Oh,
Mountain
Snow
in
Jade Mountain.
yeah, near Lijiang.
Okay.
And so he went to that area with an intention to work on primulas. And when he got there, he realized that it was an enormous task. And he despaired about it being so enormous. So he started to hire some local people to just help with the basics of collecting and processing the material that he had. And he first hired women. He hired a few women. One, I think, was no, there was one from the town of Dali. Another couple of women who worked with him, but who seemed to have been his introduction to this particular village, which, by the way, he kind of had to pass through anyway to get onto the mountain. So there were various ways in which he kind of introduced himself to this village. But in this village, he found that the folks there were very familiar with the mountain and knew a great deal about the plants on the mountain. And so he started to hire from this village. It was a good choice because these were tough, seasoned, very often extremely well-traveled men. He switched to men, which is kind of a pity. It would have made in some ways a pretty interesting story if he'd kept hiring people from both sexes, but he didn't. I mean, he switched to men, and many of these men had been involved in the long distance trade through the what is known as the tea and horse route, up through Yunnan into Tibet. They knew a lot about the region already. And as soon as he started to work with them, they started to learn a lot more. So, and eventually he learned that they were extremely trustworthy and that they could be sent out in teams headed by, teams of a few, 3 or 4 people, each with a kind of a team leader. And they would do very well on their own, just collecting plants in the genuses that he directed them to, because they had a good deal of their own knowledge already about what those plants were.
Yeah, so touch on that a little bit. I noticed in your book that it seemed there were times, while he might have said, go that way and go that way, that they followed these mental maps of their own, maybe based on their own cultural history.
Yeah, no, that's an important point in the book, and I try to puzzle it out. It was a very difficult point to make, but eventually I did discover, wait, so Forrest has these letters saying, I'm sending the men, to this place and that place. And then when they come back, he has letters saying they returned from this place and that place, which were nowhere near where he sent them, with an enormous haul of rhododendrons and primulas. And I'd be like, what is going on here? So, studying the maps and studying ritual texts, I eventually worked out that early on, in particular, Forrest had hopes for regions sort of to the east of the village and the mountain where these folks lived, regions that there was very little indigenous textual knowledge about. By textual knowledge, I mean it wasn't included in long ritual texts that people would use in order to direct spirits and ghosts around the landscape. Things like the exorcism texts that I had already studied, but with a different group. So east of that, and also interestingly enough, we get the impression as well that from Forrest's later letters to his bosses at Edinburgh, that to the east, it was, the plants he were interested in, the variety of them gradually thinned out. Whereas to the west and to the north, they were growing sort of ever more various, and ever more diverse. In any case, so he'd send them to these places in the east, and some of them were places I'm quite familiar with myself, and that's why I was particularly interested in. And they'd end up going to other places, and I eventually kind of just basically figured out that they were following routes that were textual, that roots that had been established in ritual texts that were read very frequently in their village. So I did a lot of work on figuring out, like, there are many, many different ritual texts that were used in this area. And I did a lot of work figuring out which ones were actually being read in that village at the time, and then what they said about the landscape. And it turned out that the routes that these men eventually ended up going on, sometimes Forrest directing them because they'd had good results there before, sometimes just breaking with Forrest's instructions and going where they wanted. Those routes were the routes eventually that became the most established routes for Forrest's whole enterprise of botanical exploration.
So it intrigues me that his personality. It seemed that when you look at all documents about him, that he had a volatile personality. So in those moments when they did something he asked them different, did he react strongly, or did he just revel in the large halls?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that is we can't be sure, because what he recorded was that he was reveling in these large halls. And he didn't record, oh, I sent them, to Ljunggren, and they ended up going up the Salween. He basically says they ended up going up the Salween, and they brought back this, and that. I'm going to send another party there, at the end of the season to collect seeds, right? At the same time, it's pretty clear from his writing that he knew the names of only one or two of these guys, and that he interacted principally with one or two of these guys, and the rest, and these guys, carried his instructions to the rest. So he did his best, like most colonial scientists, to maintain a certain distance between himself and the people who were working for him.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, because at the same time that in order to maintain his sense of who he was as basically lower class or working class struggling botanical collector working for people with great privilege in Scotland and England, maintain a sense of who he was. He did need to kind of keep a distance between himself and the local people, and not have that distance disturbed. But at the same time, they were the only people around, and he was lonely. And he, as much as any of us, craved company and conversation. So I kind of have the feeling that despite himself, he came to see certain guys, Naxi guys from Muluku, as his equals in some way, and to see them and treat them with respect, knowing that he owed his scientific success to them, and respecting their their ability a great deal, he kind of learned how to be friends, at least in some way, although still in a distant way.
Yeah. And when he would correspond or go back to Scotland, it didn't seem that he brought that appreciation with him. Maybe a couple of comments here and there in a letter, but
Yeah.
uh, are there instances that he maybe was a little more effusive in his appreciation for what they had done?
No, no. When I read the, letters to his wife and sons, of course they have a different tone than the letters to his boss, Balfour. But those letters still, they're very careful in what they say about the folks around him. They have a way of, all of his letters have a way of kind of, using the caricatures that were floating around at the time, to sort of dipping into this morass of extremely disgusting racist language about Chinese people in general. And but like other folks who worked, other Westerners who worked in this part of China, they would often contrast Chinese folks in general to the indigenous people whom they kind of became close to. And so, where there was a positive kind of rhetoric about the indigenous people, it was always comparing them to Chinese people in general who were, you know, who were spoken of in racist terms. So one could respect the indigenous people in some ways that respect that was like afforded to them but denied to Chinese people in general. It was a tricky kind of line that all of these guys were walking in their personal lives, in their lives at home, and in their lives in the field. It was a very contradictory kind of life for these botanists who engage really closely with people in China.
Yeah, and I think you touch on that a little bit in the book as well, that for George Forrest, there was a conflict in how he interacted with the Chinese in the way that they looked at him, stared at him. That, when he first experienced and saw other people being violent, that he never thought he could cross that line. Can you talk a little bit to him crossing that line, how that changed dealing with the Naxi, and maybe is there something about the Naxi versus Chinese culture of the time that
Sure.
is distinct?
So George Forrest and the other botanists who traveled, in China at that time, China wasn't India. China was not a country that had been subject to colonialism for very long. There were colonialism. Sorry, there were many colonial interests in China, but there was but this part of China in particular wasn't. It was a sphere of interest for the French. The British had interest there as well, but there was no colonial regime that really was there to kind of maintain the power of colonial workers, whether they're scientific or bureaucratic, like these guys. So they were kind of cast into this place where they had no protection, no institutions behind them. Really, it was just China. And the one protection they did have was their sense of superiority to Chinese people. So they were very racist and indulged in a lot of racist, kind of language. Forrest did at first, he was like, these consular officials are treating the people in the streets very badly. Like they have they have like thugs that go around with them and beat a path open for them. And that's horrible. But at the same time, he was made very, very uncomfortable by the way that as a foreigner, he was looked at all the time. He was just looked at all the time, stared at all the time. And in fact, one of the forms of photography that all of these guys indulged in was just turning the camera on the crowds that was staring at them to get a sense of, to give the viewer, I guess, or to capture that, the sense of extreme discomfort, I think, that these, British people really, British and American, yeah, but or Italian, one of them. But anyway, these European people, the sense of discomfort they had when it was just about open staring,
Mhm.
which in China at the time was simply not, it was not aggressive, impolite, necessarily at all. It wasn't, it was simple, sort of, there weren't restraints on the way that people looked at at each other. Curiosity was open, and people didn't hide their gaze in
Mhm.
general in China, right? But when they got to indigenous places, and this is one of the reasons they could respect indigenous people in the way they didn't respect Chinese people in general, these very poor people living in extremely difficult conditions simply had a different way of using their eyes. Their sense of how to politely use their eyes aligned more closely with the sense that Europeans had of how to politely use your eyes. So I experienced this, in like I experienced this myself doing field work, especially early on, where everywhere I went in China, like gosh, I'm very old. So, I traveled in China first in the 80s. And this was a time for a lot of the places I went, no recently there had been no foreigners at all there. And I was really weird looking, and very, 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 very obviously not Chinese. And people would stare at me, and I was, not a very outgoing young man, and I just didn't like it. I mean, it was fine at first, but then it got like everywhere you go, everything you do is being inspected by a crowd of people who have no business inspecting you, right? And it brought to me like very difficult feelings. But when I went to indigenous places, especially in the mountains and especially in more kind of remote rural places, people might have been absolutely as curious. I think they were, or even more so. And I was even less of a kind of, like people had never seen any human who looked much like me, but they simply didn't look at me, right? They simply did not stare. And they had sort of ways of being polite that actually made me very much more comfortable. I felt less kind of scrutinized, even though I think people were scrutinizing me very carefully. I felt less scrutinized, and that made me feel more comfortable. So kind of reflecting back on the experience of Forrest and others like him, I think that something similar was going on. They would often remark on how people in these villages weren't staring, and on and how what a welcome change that was, right? So yeah.
Interesting. It kind of reminds me of like the Navajo culture. You don't really make eye contact in
Yes,
culture.
absolutely. Right.
Um,
Where you only make eye contact in sort of intimate settings, for particular reasons. You're careful about the way you use your eyes. And Tibeto-Burman kinds of speaking places are very much that way as well.
okay. So I'm going to butcher his name, so you'll need to say it. But how did you find Zhao Shengjing's real name?
So obviously, I was very curious about this guy because he was mentioned a lot. He was mentioned a lot in Forrest texts as my headman, my like my main guy, and he was known as Old Chow, Chao, I think, or maybe Chau, Old Chow. And this was well known. And there was, even the archivists at Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, where I did a lot of the work for this book, alerted me to like Old Chow and like you might be interested. And I was very interested. So I pursued every single reference to Old Chow I did not get any closer to knowing who he was, what kind of family he had, who among the other men might have been related to him, all the things that I was very curious about, right? I would go back there day after day after day for a very long summer. And eventually, I think the archivists there got comfortable enough with me so that when they were very busy one day, they were like, there's nobody to tend to Erik right now or to bring books out for him, to bring boxes out for him. But it's okay. We'll give him a pair of gloves, archive gloves, white cotton gloves, and just let him go down to the basement and see what he finds. And in one of those boxes was an account book that was a book that showed the amount of money spent on buying some curiosities, basically, that Forrest wanted brought back from someplace on the Upper Salween, as I recall. And it listed the name of the item and the amount of money, and then it was signed by Zhao Chengzheng, and then there were some notes by Forrest in the margins of this book as well. And so I was like, yeah, and I found my guy. It's very clear that this is the guy who Forrest has been trusting to head his people, and that it tracks that he's called Old Chow, because he would have been called Lao Zhao, like old Zhao, in Chinese. And that was the way to spell it, in the kind of romanization system that Forrest was using. So that finally clued me into, actually, this guy, finally, I do know what his name is. I didn't find much more about his family, though,
Okay. But about him, did you get a sense of what he was like, what mattered to him?
Yeah. Yeah, and I again, this sense is only reflected through Forrest's own writing to his family and to his supervisors. But yeah, I mean, this was an absolutely tough, tenacious man who was very well respected in his village. Partly he was well respected because he was paid more than, I mean, you could make more doing this work than you could make doing anything else in that village. But partly it was very clear he was an elder who would have had a lot of respect anyway, because he was the guy who was able to kind of drum up men, some of them his age, many of them younger, who would take these very difficult journeys on behalf of Forrest. So tough, tenacious, and extremely bright, right? Was able to read and write some Chinese, was able to communicate with Forrest in a way that Forrest found comprehensible, which was not an easy thing to do across linguistic barriers and cultural barriers. At the time, the linguistic barriers were Forrest's Chinese was okay, but not that great. Zhao Chengzheng's Chinese was okay, but not that great. I found several drawings that were clearly made by Zhao Chengzheng. They had his name on them, and they were maps of the area that were annotated by Forrest in Forrest's hands as well. So that was part of the process of communication. But so he was all those things: tough, tenacious, extremely bright, good communicator.
Okay. So for Zhao Chengzheng, going forward after this point, so 1932 happens, and as far as any books that I've been able to find, he essentially falls off the map.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened to them? What did they do and partake in after Forrest's passing?
Yeah. So after Forrest died, many of the same guys and their nephews and sons ended up working for another botanist, Joseph Francis Charles Rock, who used their knowledge and their sense of adventure in his own way. And then beyond that, right, like, the revolution happened, and so the Communist Party takes over, and Rock is chased out of Yunnan, and then this becomes one of millions of villages where basically land reform is enacted. The people who had respect and power, suddenly became the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and and for decades since, it's remained a great, interesting, but very poor Naxi village in a place where the land is rocky and difficult, where it's very difficult to make a living, and where young people tend to just go to the city in order to make their way. Yeah.
So very much like a lot of villages and towns in China. Okay. So what have I not asked that you feel viewers would should know about Forrest or the Naxi?
Well, so I mean, I guess I would love to convey the sense to listeners that um, this kind of science in the West, Western botanical science, which was a huge enterprise in the 18th and 19th centuries, um, always depended on local people who were scientists themselves in some ways. I say scientists because the Naxi people whom Forrest worked with did have a science. It was a very different kind of science. It was a science that was involved ritual and involved writing and involved uh, you know was all about communication with and manipulation of an unseen world. But at the same time, it was a science, and that science depended on evidence, like the evidence of plants and plant species and how they differed, which, and all around the world, people like this were involved in the immense enterprise of botanical exploration and classification that happened in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And yet, they're lost to history for the most part. Those people who were at the center of the enterprise, those indigenous, mostly people who were at the center of that enterprise. So that was one of the things I wanted to convey in this book, was that this episode of exploration was absolutely, these folks were absolutely centered to it. And one of the results of this book was that when botanists made a revision of the genus of bearberry, where they basically went through the materials that had been collected in China and revised this entire genus into, trying to put it on a more sort of scientific footing. One of these botanists had read the book and named one of the bearberry plants after Zhao Chengzheng, which is great. Finally, there are many Forrestii plants in China, but there's finally a Zhao Chengzheng plant. Which, it's a tiny thing, but at the same time, it brings the name of this extremely accomplished explorer and botanist into this, into the in the name of a species of plant, finally, for the first time.
Yeah.
And I do take care to mention in the book as best I can the names of every one of the other men who worked in these groups of men that were working for Forrest, as best I can. It was difficult because they weren't being written about in Chinese. I'm taking the names from English language, letters that don't give a very accurate sort of account of what a Chinese name and characters, really is. So that was part of it. Yeah.
And maybe you haven't been close to it in a little while, since this was 15 years ago, but have you gotten a sense that beyond naming a plant after Chow, that they've made any progress in addressing that lack of acknowledgement?
I mean, I give a lot of credit to colleagues in China who do work on, both anthropologists and botanists and historians in China who do work in indigenous regions of China, like in Western China, basically, and who have used this book and other inspirations to try to make closer connections between what happened and what is still happening, continues to happen with indigenous people and the kind of exploration and of the worlds of plants and animals. They deserve a lot of credit for turning back for turning to, trying to understand those contributions and to try to make those contributions visible.
Mm.
So there is a lot of work in China that does try to do that. At the same time, just like anywhere in the world, it's the people who actually have the credentials to do much writing about this, they're people in academic, in an academic world or in the journalistic world, people who are not from these communities for the most part. So, and it's rare that to find people from indigenous communities in China, at least rural indigenous communities in China, actually, be given the privilege to use their own voices to speak about their own people. It's increasingly rare, actually. It happened a lot in the 80s, but increasingly as the Chinese regime turns more towards an idea of, everybody is Chinese and everybody should really admit that and be the same. Turning away from the ethic of the 80s where minority nationalities were recognized prominently and fully as nationalities of peoples with their own customs, traditions, and histories that really should be respected. So that's being turned away from. There's a new ethic, and so it's becoming more and more difficult for at least the people I know who are from indigenous communities to really speak about the kinds of knowledge that those communities developed and carry into the present.